So first off, welcome everyone to Getting Started with Workforce Analytics. Thank you very much for coming along today. My name is Ben Lamb and I'll be chairing this webinar. Now just a couple of quick housekeeping items first. Your audio is muted, so you'll be able to hear us, but we won't be able to hear you through the presentation. Now, if you do have any questions, in your side panel, there's actually a question and a chat area where you can type your questions or have a chat to Pete or myself if you need to. So please feel free to use it, and we'll get back to you hopefully during the webinar. But if it's a lot of people, a lot of questions, then we might have to get back to you after the webinar. So one last thing, don't worry about taking any notes. At the end of the webinar, we're actually going to send out a recording of the webinar to everyone. So you won't have to worry about scribbling things down. You can pay attention and yeah, get everything later to have another look at it. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pass you across to Peter Forbes, who is the Managing Director of Navigo, and will be running through this presentation today. So over to you, Pete.
Thanks, Ben, for that, and thanks for your really interesting trivia about an alligator and a fire hydrant. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. Thank you for coming along. We've got a great turnout to the webinar, and I think it shows just how much interest this topic is starting to generate in HR circles. I have a long history working with HR payroll systems and reporting against those systems, and both Ben and myself actually have been involved in that space for a long time. And I guess traditionally there's been a lot of complexity and effort in getting information out, and then once you actually get that information out, it was just kind of a rows and columns on a spreadsheet. And while I saw those reports being used, I never, saw those reports as driving any major business outcomes, either in HR in the way they manage people or in the business itself. And it's kind of, when we talk about workforce analytics, it's amazing. If I look back to the 90s and the noughties, as they call them, it's amazing how many vendors out there had analytics as optional packages in there, and they had all these weird and wonderful names like strategy into action and HR KPIs and things like that, and they never really delivered on the promise. A lot of those modules just grew dust because they were complex. There's a lot of technical challenges to getting them going, and the business never got any value out of them. What we're seeing, and that's starting to change to these days as technology and the tools get better and better, and the advent of all this information and data that's being produced in the world has enabled these new disciplines of big data's the buzzword, and organizations are realizing there's valuable insights and actions they can take by examining their workforce information. And the realities of that are now apparent. So this is what this webinar today is about, introducing you into some of that. Navigo is proud to announce our partnership with Visio, which is a next generation workforce analytics workforce planning tool that's built for the cloud and built for workforce information and HR information. This webinar today, we're not going to be talking about that tool. We're really talking about the space and where tools like Visio are now starting to give you a lot more leverage and moving you away from a metric-driven organization through to analytics. But be sure we will be covering this tool in a further webinar to take you through it a little bit more. So really the agenda today is, as Ben mentioned, there is going to be a copy of this webinar. We record all our webinars now and put them up on our Navigo blog, so you can play these back later. But look, there was actually some recent research from the Boston Consulting Group that was stating workforce analytics is now the #1 or #2 priority for HR. And really what workforce analytics is about is how it can answer questions that deliver real business outcomes. And it's about gaining insights into your workforce and backing up, you know, a lot of the hunches and feels that the HR team may already know. And, you know, once your organisation is over a certain size, you know, 3,000 employee organisation, you can't just rely on, you know, anecdotal evidence anymore. You can really miss those key learnings if you're not really delving into the data, and that's what Workforce Analytics delivers. And, you know, it's trying to answer questions like who are our high performers in the organisation, and what factors influence creating those high performers. Is it their location? Is it their compensation brackets? Is it their tenure, or you know, how many courses they've been on? That sort of thing. So you know, there's a lot of insights we can get by looking at different factors, but in the end it's about delivering some sort of business value, whether that's reducing your operating costs, increasing revenue, or having you know, people more productive. So we're going to go through a couple of different things and look at, you know, the differences between metrics and analytics. What are some of the factors driving that demand? And I think they're fairly obvious. Then we'll get into the analytics landscape, and what we mean by that is internally in your organizations, how traditionally that problem's been trying to be solved, and where you can move to. We'll also look at getting started with analytics and sort of the steps you need to go through, and there's some common then mistakes to avoid when you're going into projects like this. And certainly my experience, and I'm sure a lot of people in the room, you know, there's a lot of failed business intelligence projects out there in organisations. First, I just want to show you a piece of research that Josh Bersin did as part of his group, and they've since been acquired by Deloitte, I think just late last year. But when they're looking at analytics and what it can do for HR, and they looked at a whole bunch of organisations around the globe, and they kind of categorised the level of maturity in this into sort of 4 basic areas. And what they found is that, you know, 56% of organisations are at what they call the level 1 stage, which is reactive operational reporting. Reports will get produced on demand. They're coming out of the HR systems. They're fairly basic, and you know, they're ad hoc. Going up above that, at 30% of organisations I found were in the proactive reporting stage. So that means they knew the types of reports they wanted to get out of their about their workforce. They maybe set up some simple dashboards. They've got some end-of-month reports that they're producing. Level 3 is strategic analytics, and they only found 10% of people at this stage. And this is where you're really starting to dive into some of those reports, and they're segmenting some of that information and doing that further analysis. And they might be looking at, you know, whether if you know, you've got your turnover as a simple metric, but they might start to looking at that by different dimensions, whether that's by location, by gender, by compensation bracket, those sort of things. So they're getting a little bit strategic with that information that they're reporting. Finally, at the top we have what is kind of the ultimate goal, which is to get to predictive analytics, and only 4% of organisations are represented in this area, and that's about based on the performance of our past information, being able to project that into the future and seeing what may happen if these historical trends continue, and knowing that, well, here are some factors that in the past have you know, increased our involuntary redundancies, or sorry, our involuntary terminations, and what are some of those factors that could be projecting into the future. So what I want to do now is just do a simple poll for the audience to find out where you think your organisation sits in this area. And what I'll get Ben to do is launch that poll, which it looks like he's done. So if everyone can just sort of give a guesstimate, and we'll just give that a couple of seconds to get going, and We'll leave it for a few more seconds. We'll keep going. Yeah, we're about 72%. So we'll give it just another 5 seconds, and then Ben, maybe you might want to show the results. It's a pretty good turnout there. 78, yeah. Okay, so I can't see this on my screen if you're showing those results or not, Ben, but it looks like it's locked in, and yeah, it says 41% at level 1, 42% at level 2, a few in at level 3, and 1% in at level 4. So look, it's kind of interesting that our poll reflects some of the research by Burson as well. Are you seeing that on the screen, guys? Yep, awesome, awesome. Okay, so look, a few basic definitions before we get too far in. A metric is just a simple system or standard of measurement. So it's about how long or how far something is. It's just a single number. Analytics, on the other hand, is where you start to put individual metrics together to compose some sort of analysis and get some insight into some of those numbers. So you start to get some meaning from a number of different metrics, and you may be triangulating those together to get something. The two, of course, are closely linked. You can't have analytics without metrics. So metrics are really the building blocks, and you need to build the metrics so you can slowly build up a full suite of analytics. And really what analytics is trying to do is give you an answer, an observation, or some sort of trend. Analytics also tend to be delivered visually because humans can really comprehend and get better understanding of looking at something that's presented visually and can start to associate either patterns or trends in that information. So if we just touch on this a little bit further quickly, I think a lot of the focus in HR is on metrics and HR reporting at that level 1 and level 2, but really analytics tries to take you up into that level 3 and level 4 of that Burson model. And some simple points here is that, okay, I've just lost my demo. Sorry, I'll come back to it. Analytics, rather than measuring a single data point, analytics connect you to multiple data points. Analytics really is about delivering value to HR and to the business to either say, here's somewhere where we know we can save some costs or some money, or here's something that will drive an action or drive strategy. And I think that's really important. You being able to use the information you're seeing and do something about that. Whether that's, putting an engagement program in for some really unengaged people who have a high risk of turning over, and the cost of replacing some of those people is very expensive, and you also know that given your recruitment and your time to hire in maybe a certain location is going to take a long time, that could have a really potential issue in, say, your production or your manufacturing areas of your business. We've already talked about analytics helps you project into the future as well, and that it gives you that visual type of representation. Examples of that is like metrics you're looking at, things like what is my head count, when really with analytics you're trying to delve deeper, and instead of just saying what is my head count, you're really saying, okay, who are my top performers in the organization, and where are they? What are the key characteristics of those top performers, so I can replicate and try and focus our training and development on breeding more people who really perform for the organization. Recruitment's a really interesting one because you need to know, why you have a recruitment. You might have a workforce plan of how many people you need to recruit. You really want to identify what are the best sources for recruiting those people. Not just the people who come and work and maybe leave after 6 months, but what are my sources of recruitment for the people who really become really useful in the organization. So if we look at a couple of examples, this is a simple headcount report. It's a pretty typical one over certain time periods, the movements in different departments. the numbers are in different departments. If you compare that to an analytic of headcount analysed, and what this graphic here is showing you is the movements in and out of the organisation, and it's giving you a good understanding of who's coming in and who's coming out of that organisation, and then the net change to that. So while in this example here there might be a total of 546 moves, the net effect to headcount is actually only 3. If we look at something like gender composition, and there's been some recent changes to Australian legislation that requires organisations to be reporting on their gender composition. And you know, simple head counts and this many males and females doesn't give you a lot of insight. But if we, in this graphic, this is comparing you know, males to females in the organisation by different quarters. And what we can see here is, you know, 2013 and 2012, they were pretty comparable. But when we look at our 2014 to date results, we can see that there's a real imbalance there. You know, we've obviously had a big push, and a lot of more males are entering the organisation. Alternatively, you can cut up the same information and look at it from different dimensions, and that might be by role classifications and other information. When we start to talk about predictive, and you know, our experience out in the market is everyone kind of asks us, well, what predictive type of information can you show? This is an example of saying you have an overall resignation rate, but really what analytics starts to bring to the table is showing you what factors can either increase or decrease that rate. And here in this graphic we can see that you know, people who have been in the organisation for a long time tend to stick around. We can see, you know, the people in San Jose tend to stick around as well. If they're paid at a certain rate, they're in the finance department. On the other hand, on the other side of the equation, we can see that, you know, we've got some high resignation rate if you tend to be in sales and you haven't been in the organisation for a long time. So, you know, workforce analytics tools now have more sophisticated algorithms. They're able to delve into that information a lot quicker and draw out some more sophisticated insights and deliver them to you in an easier format. So if we look at some of the factors driving this change, and I'll just touch on this slightly because I think, you know, it's fairly obvious the value workforce analytics can bring to an organisation. I think where people get stuck is how you get started with it, and we'll cover that, talk about that a bit more in the next couple of slides. But really, you know, the change in demographic shift in the workforce, skills shortages, and the competitive pressure, all factors that are playing to say we really need to focus on how we get some better value out of the people we have. And, you know, obviously workforce cost is probably your one or two most biggest costs in the business. So therefore, it makes sense to focus on that, to how you can get more value. There's been a lot of research out there that shows that people really do make a difference to a bottom line, and I guess you know, that's seen where there's businesses with basically the same business model, but one organisation clearly outshines the other, and I think that's because of the culture in those organisations, you know, the type of people they attract and the type of people they retain. You know, people really do make the difference, and the data proves it. So if we start to look at some of what have been some of the traditional barriers to workforce analytics, and you know, I kind of, you know, this makes me nostalgic when I think about data warehouse projects and those sort of things. But the issues are is you have all this data that sits there about your people and your workforce in these disparate systems, whether it's your payroll HRS, your recruitment system, your learning management, and of course the old faithful, which is spreadsheets. And you know, traditionally what's happened is there's either been a big push to do a technical implementation to solve this, or organisations have a short-term push on workforce analytics where they work hard to produce some key analytics, but it takes an effort and it's not sustainable. So it might happen over a couple of months, but because of the effort, it just doesn't keep going. So there's a big gap here. Traditionally, that gap's been filled with building a data warehouse where you're querying everything, and you're trying to get your data into all, the right format into those tables in the data warehouse, the metadata. You then create queries on those data, you know, producing reports, figuring out what dashboards you want, the scorecards, and then there's the business questions from then. And you know, the way that whole space has worked in the past is that if the questions change, you need to go back and cut the data differently to answer the new questions, because the queries aren't in the right format to be able to overlay a dimension across another unless you specifically ask for that. And that's changing. So what those solutions have looked like is kind of divided up into 4 different areas. You know, starting at probably the most ubiquitous out there, which is the spreadsheet solution. And you know, spreadsheets dominate back offices and organisations today. One is because they're so generic and they're so powerful in terms of manipulating information and doing a lot of transformation. But they also have their drawbacks. They're very prone to error. They require a fairly high level of expertise to use, and they're not easily shared in a way that's secure or that's not going to break, you know, some of the things people have set up. If we go to the top left, you know, your HR payroll system will usually have some sort of reporting option, but again, these reports are very focused on transactional, operational HR. They're not giving you a lot of analytical capability, and of course they don't bring in information from any other system. They're not tying information from your finance system, for example. Traditionally, when you get into analytics, it's been the BI solutions, and you know, they're very expensive. It takes a long time to set up, a lot of IT experience, and they tend to be very heavy technical tools rather than focused on the business users. What's happening today, and now what's becoming more popular, is the advent of dedicated purpose-built workforce analytics tools. They have an advantage that they tend to be a lot shorter implementation because they're deployed in the cloud, so there's no infrastructure. The data you need to give these systems is a lot rawer, so they're taking a lot of the information and doing a lot of the transformation for you. So it's easy to do that extraction, and you can possibly skip that data warehouse step. And finally, I guess the tool is designed for HR and business users, and the tools try to draw you and direct you to the answers you need to have to make some decisions. So how do you get started? This has always been a bit of a bugbear, and there's a white paper on we have available on the Visio website that you can get about getting started in workforce analytics that goes into this in a lot more detail. But basically the high-level steps is to define the questions, and analytics is all about what are the questions for the business, and this is something a lot of people get wrong, is they start worrying about the data first, and instead they get buried in the where are we going to get the data's not right, and the focus and the value of this project just quickly loses its emphasis because you haven't defined really what are the questions we're trying to answer that is going to help us. Next, it's about accessing the data, and again, that's a big worry, and we'll talk about that more. Answering the questions, and there's always that big roadblock with organisations is we don't know what we don't know. So how do we get some of these answers in a way where they're even answers to questions we haven't even thought about? And then finally, you want to share the answers, bring those insights out to not from the HR team, but out to the lines of business and some of the business leaders and line managers. So we'll walk through these in a little bit more detail. So defining questions. One of the big stoppers here is coming up with this big laundry list of questions, and I think if you come up with this huge list of questions, that's going to stop the project pretty quickly, because it's just the scope is too big. We'd recommend identifying 3 to 5 questions about really what are you trying to do as a business. You know, is the business trying to grow? Is it trying to get more productive? Are we trying to retain core talent in some of our business areas, or are we trying to find what are the critical roles in our business that make a direct impact on revenues? You know, there's been lots of good case studies about you know, big retail organisations identifying one critical role in a store that based on the performance or engagement of that one person has a dramatic impact on the revenue takings for an individual store. And I mean, that's a pretty remarkable insight that, you know, if you could potentially increase revenues in one store by 15% just by making sure one person is engaged, that's a pretty good outcome for a business owners. So really, you know, these questions are going to take a little while. It'll take a few iterations, and it requires, you know, the HR team to sit down with the senior leaders in the different areas of the business and really understand from those guys what are the numbers they're worried about and what are the key concerns they're trying to figure out, and then trying to tie that back into people, because, you know, if it's the sales team and they're worried about how they're going to meet their quarter targets, you know, and they know that at, say, the end of the financial year and the end of December is their busy time, you know, that might start getting HR to look at, you know, when people are taking leave, and is there any policies we're doing around when our sales team should be on and off in terms of their leave. So getting those questions right is really, really the first step to doing things. The next one is accessing data, and look, a lot of people worry about the quality of their data and saying we're not ready for this because our data is just not in any condition. And the thing about workforce analytics is you don't need to be 100% accurate all the time, because a lot of what you're doing is any answer you're getting, while some answers you want to be definitive accurate, some are just giving you approximations and moving you towards some trends and hints and hunches about what's going on. Taking a data-first approach is not a good idea with an analytics project. It's defining those questions. One of those reasons, and my experience is once you start, you know the questions you want to ask, and you then understand what data you need to answer those questions, even if that data is not in a good format at the start, the mere practice of focusing on those metrics and that data that you need to get better will over time start to cleanse it and start to get it in a better condition. Why defining questions is really valuable as well is it's more defendable when you're starting to build your business case for workforce analytics. You know, it's no good trying to say, hey, we want to get a budget for this because we want to clean up our information. That's not really going to get people listening. But if you can say, we're trying to answer these strategic questions for the business, and this is how it's going to deliver value, you'll have a much better business case there. So in terms of answering questions, this is where a lot of modern day workforce analytic tools are really good. They try and lead you to some of these questions through the tool itself. And there's a lot of industry accepted standards around HR metrics. Workforce analytics and workforce metrics, the practice and the discipline has been around for a long time, and you know, there's an industry standard, there's industry standard metrics that are recognized in HR, and you don't need to go and redefine what turnover means, for example. So the answers are something you can get out of the tool pretty easily these days. What you want to do with those answers is then share them out to the rest of the organization. And it's really HR's role to give this out in a way that's more accessible and consumable to the rest of the group. And again, this is where analytics plays a big part over metrics. It's more in a visual format in a way that they can consume and easily understand. So once you get started, obviously the last piece is to look for a solution that can match what you're trying to do and the time frames you're trying to do it in. Some of the top mistakes to avoid when you're looking at workforce analytics is to treat it as an IT project, and this is something that's probably less occurring these days, but in the past definitely these projects has been driven as an IT project, and IT plays an enabling role in these projects, but not the lead role. This should be really driven by HR, and again, it's the questions and answers that's going to provide value to the business. The other part of this is not boiling the ocean. So a lot of projects fail because they're saying we need 700 metrics to slice and dice any which way, and it's the projects are focusing too much on the content and the volume as opposed to focusing on what are the factors for success for this project. What do we really need to do? What does our success look like? Is it that we have a better recruitment strategy or our diversity is better? And if you focus on a couple of key questions, once you actually deliver on a couple of those strategic areas, people will be very keen to say, well, what else can you do for us? We've seen that progress in those two areas. You've delivered on those couple of things. What else can you do for us? And you'll have a much easier time to get funding for going out and looking at other parts of the ocean. Another one is making your approach to calculations unique and complex. And I touched on this before that, industry standards have developed about certain definitions for metrics, and you really get yourself into trouble if you try and make your own calculations unique and complex to yourself. Another drawback of that is it then makes it very hard to compare how you measure to other industries and organizations that are your peers. And a lot of what we're seeing now is benchmarking coming into these organizations, and tools that deliver workforce analytics as software as a service and cloud-based have that ability to easily benchmark your information against other like-minded industries. We haven't touched on workforce planning at all in this webinar, but really we see workforce planning as kind of the yin and the yang of workforce analytics. And the two are closely related, and you don't want to separate workforce planning from workforce analytics. To do any meaningful workforce planning, you really need to have a starting point of what's going on, and that's what analytics will give you, that starting point of here's what we look like now, how will that project into the future. As you're doing your models for workforce planning, and you want to be able to forecast things based on some of those historical trends. So, if you're looking at headcount and growing the workforce over a period of 2 to 5 years, it would be really useful to have your historic resignation rates, so you could possibly use that when you're forecasting out further. And what workforce analytics does is it enables you to plan, so you're not planning in a vacuum. You're basing some of your planning on some real good historical information that can be used. And of course, once you have that plan, you want to be able to track back to the actuals, so that you can say, well, we said at this stage of the year we were going to be at this point. How are we really tracking? And you'll have that ability to look back at analytics. So the two are really closely aligned. And I guess the final mistake is to do nothing. I think, it's pretty obvious the benefits that you can get from workforce analytics, and I think it's going to become a key competitive difference if organisations can really engage their workforce to identify the factors that make them more productive or drive costs down or increase revenue. And I think, as we can see from the popularity that we're seeing in the market, this is something that there's really no shortcut way. You need to start building on those base foundations to be able to give you the sophistication, so you can get the insights, you can get the predictive capability, and you can do some really smart workforce planning. So that's about me at this stage. I think hopefully I've given you some insight into how to get started with workforce analytics and just where that field looks like at the moment. We've got some time, I think, for some questions. Ben, I'll let you moderate the questions, and if anyone's got a question, feel free to type it into the question and answer box. We plan on doing a series of webinars over the next couple of months in this space to talk about some of the different aspects of workforce analytics. We'll have an upcoming webinar to actually show you the tool, to show you Visio and see what it can do. But as we found on this journey, as we're talking to customers and to people out in the market, there's still a fairly big requirement there for just getting some base knowledge and education about this space before they start delving into what the tools can do. So Ben, I'll pass it back to you to see if there's any questions.
All right, thanks, Pete. That was informative, so thank you for going through that. I'm getting a couple of questions firing through at the moment. So the one question we've got is, do you need a certain sized organisation for analytics to be really effective? So Pete, I'll pass that back to you and see what your thoughts are.
That's a good question, because once at a certain size organisation, they kind of say, once you get to 100 people, that's where you can't start remembering everyone's name in the organisation. And I think, with organisations a couple of hundred people, I think you get you're close enough to everyone that you get those hunches about really what the workforce is looking like. But saying that, something I was reading the other day was a problem with relying on line managers and business leaders to talk about their workforce is those built-in biases that people have about other people. One great thing about workforce analytics is it takes out a lot of that bias and subjectiveness about people. So I would say 500 employees, a couple of hundred employees, depending on the nature of the business, you'll get value from workforce analytics. But as soon as you go over 1,000 employees, I think that's where it becomes really essential.
Right, so good answer. So we've got heaps and heaps of questions, so we'll get through as many as we can. But if we don't get to your question, don't feel bad. We will touch base with you afterwards and run through them in more detail with you. So I've got a question here saying, so are you suggesting not to define your own analytics, but to take what the tools already include? What are your thoughts on that, Pete?
Yeah, definitely. Our experience with something like Visio, it comes with 300 metrics, if you want to call it that, out of the box, and it has how you calculate turnover, how you calculate resignation rates, how you calculate comp ratios. Certainly our experience with Visio and what the guys at Visio tell us as well is you take the out of the box metrics, and then if your organisation has some calculations that require different, you treat that as the exception, not as the standard. So most modern workforce analytics tools will give you that out of the box. I think, as I mentioned, it's going to slow down the project immensely, and also make it difficult for you to compare your organisation to anyone else, and taking advantage of the benchmarking capabilities that these tools offer.
Cool. I think we'll just do one more and then we'll have to get back to everyone individually, so I do apologise. Lots of questions have come through. Someone's asked, what are the top 3 HR workforce analytics? So what are the most common, I guess?
Okay, I reckon... Oh, sorry, I just knocked my headphones. Well, look, I'm probably not... There's probably more qualified workforce analytics consultants who are qualified to answer that, but I would suggest, retention, or it's around the recruitment metrics, the turnover, retention, that sort of thing are very popular, because there's obviously a cost to the business around those sort of areas. Headcount's got to be it's amazing how many organisations can't define headcount, a simple metric. So I'd say those ones around retention, turnover, and headcount. Yeah, so that's what I'd say.
I've just been told we can do one more, so I'm just looking through all the questions at the moment. So, do workforce analytics tools integrate easily with any system? So perhaps as long as it's a database, or how does the integration sort of work?
So integration is a really interesting one, and I could talk about this for a long time, integration, because as we get more cloud-based systems, the on-prem to cloud integration, the whole space is really interesting and presenting a lot of challenges, and there's some good solutions for that these days as well. And look, again, I'll come back to what Visio does with its integration. It specifies a very raw extract file for different areas or for different pieces of information. So what Visio asks is extract information about, whether it's coming from your talent or your payroll system in these different chunks of information, and they're actually loaded as CSV into the Visio application. And Visio does a lot of the transformation of that data. So the extracts are quite basic from your core systems, but of course, if you've got 5 different data points, you'll need to be getting those extracts and then pushing those up.
All right, that sounds good. We've run out of time, so with all the questions that have come through, Pete or myself will get back to you on all of those. So we will answer the questions. Do apologise. It looks like from all the questions coming through, we could have sat here all day. So we will get back to you on them afterwards. So just to wrap up, I guess. So a big thank you for Pete for running through the webinar with us, and for all of you for joining us today. I hope you got something out of it. I hope you learned something. If you missed anything during the webinar, please feel free to give us a call. Otherwise, we can touch base with you, or the Navigo blog will have a recording after once we upload it, so you can go and download that as well if you want to have another look at everything we went through. We've got another webinar which will be in the next month or so, so we'll definitely let you know the details for that one when it does come out. So just to wrap up, thank you again for joining us, and I hope you all have a fantastic day.
Yep, big thanks everyone. Thanks, Ben.